The crystal chandelier above the banquet hall caught the light like 1,000 tiny knives, each one stabbing at Henry's pride as he stood there, frozen. Victoria's voice cut through the murmur of the crowd, sharp and deliberate, her words dripping with venom. "Oh, Henry," she drawled, her crimson lips curling into a smirk. "Always so predictable." The room seemed to tilt, the polished marble floor slipping beneath his feet as her laughter rang out. A sound that used to make his heart race, now a cruel echo that hollowed him out. The banquet hall was a masterpiece of excess, all gold leaf and velvet, with champagne flowing like water. Henry had always hated these events, the way the air smelled of expensive perfume and desperation. But Victoria thrived here, her laughter a weapon, her beauty a shield. She was holding court at the center of the room, surrounded by her cyber sports team and their sponsors, her sleek black dress catching the light like oil on water. Henry had been standing awkwardly at the edge of the crowd, nursing a drink he didn't want, when she turned her gaze on him like a predator spotting wounded prey. "You know," she said, her voice carrying just enough to draw the attention of everyone within earshot, "Henry here still thinks table tennis is a sport." The crowd tittered, a ripple of amusement spreading through the room. Henry felt his face flush, the heat crawling up his neck like a rash. He wanted to say something, to defend himself, but the words stuck in his throat like shards of glass. Victoria's eyes gleamed with triumph, and for a moment, he saw the woman he'd married, the one who used to laugh with him, not at him. He glanced down at the glass in his hand, the ice cubes melting into the amber liquid. The sound of clinking glasses and murmured conversations seemed to fade, replaced by the sharp crack of something breaking. It took him a second to realize it was his own grip tightening on the glass, the stem snapping clean in two. The sound was swallowed by the noise of the party, but the shards of glass in his palm felt like a wake-up call. He looked up, and for the first time he really saw her. Not the woman he'd loved, but the one who'd been wearing her face like a mask. The room seemed to close in around him, the laughter and chatter pressing against his skull like a vice. He turned and walked away, the taste of copper in his mouth where he'd bitten his tongue. The shattered glass in his hand was nothing compared to the cracks spreading through his chest, each one a reminder of how long he'd been pretending everything was fine. As he pushed through the heavy oak doors and into the cool night air, the sound of Victoria's laughter followed him, a ghost he couldn't shake. The streetlights flickered above him, their glow dimming as if even they couldn't bear to shine on the wreckage of his life. He stood there for a moment, his breath coming in short, sharp bursts, the weight of everything he'd ignored pressing down on him like a stone. And then, like a storm breaking, the anger came. Not the quick, hot flash he was used to, but something deeper, colder. It settled in his chest, heavy and solid, and for the first time in years he felt awake. The banquet hall behind him was a fortress of lies, but out here, in the quiet dark, the truth was waiting, and Henry was finally ready to face it. The rain had started to fall as Henry sat in the dimly lit kitchen, the faint hum of the refrigerator the only sound breaking the silence. His son, Ethan, stood in the doorway, shoulders hunched, eyes darting to the floor. Henry had seen that look before, years ago when Ethan was 10 and had accidentally broken the antique vase in the hallway. But this wasn't about a vase. Ethan's hands trembled as he clutched something small and rectangular, his knuckles white. "Dad," Ethan began, his voice barely above a whisper, like he was afraid the walls might hear. "There's something I need to tell you." Henry felt his chest tighten, the weight of Ethan's tone pressing down on him. He gestured to the chair across from him, but Ethan stayed rooted in place, his gaze fixed on the floor. The rain outside tapped against the window, a steady rhythm that seemed to mock the growing unease in the room. Ethan finally stepped forward, sliding a business card across the table. It was crisp, embossed, the kind of thing you'd expect from someone with more money than sense. The name on it, Liam Carter, meant nothing to Henry, but the logo beneath it did. It was the same one emblazoned on Victoria's team jerseys, the same one she'd been so proud to represent. "Mom's been seeing him," Ethan said, his voice cracking on the last word. His eyes flicked up to meet Henry's, and for a moment, Henry saw the little boy who used to climb into bed with him after a nightmare. But this wasn't a nightmare Henry could wake up from. "Seeing him?" Henry echoed, his voice flat, as if saying it out loud might make it less real. Ethan nodded, His jaw clenched like he was fighting back tears. "I didn't want to tell you," Ethan continued, his words tumbling out now, faster and less controlled. "But I couldn't keep it to myself anymore. It's been going on for months, Dad. I've seen them together. At her tournaments, at the hotel after matches. She thinks no one notices, but I do." Henry stared at the card, the edges of it blurring as his vision swam. He thought of Victoria's late nights, her sudden interest in team meetings that always seemed to run longer than necessary. He thought of the way she'd laugh at her phone, her fingers flying across the screen, always too quick to show him what she was typing. He thought of the way she'd started wearing perfume again, something floral and expensive, even when she was just lounging around the house. "How long?" Henry asked, his voice low, almost a growl. Ethan hesitated, his fingers drumming nervously against the edge of the table. "Since the summer," he admitted. "Maybe longer. I don't know for sure. But it's not just, it's more than that. He's been giving her money, Dad. For the team. For her." Henry's hand clenched into a fist, his nails digging into his palm. The room felt too small suddenly, the walls closing in. He wanted to scream, to smash something, to demand answers from Victoria right then and there. But he stayed seated, his body rigid, his mind racing. Ethan's eyes were pleading now, begging Henry to understand, to forgive him for being the messenger. "I'm sorry, Dad," he whispered. "I didn't know what else to do." Henry reached out, his hand trembling as he picked up the business card. The name on it, Liam Carter, seemed to burn into his skin. He didn't know who this man was, but he knew one thing: he was going to find out. And when he did, there would be hell to pay. The study smelled faintly of ink and old leather, the kind of scent that used to feel like home. Now it just felt like a trap. Henry stood by the desk, his fingers brushing against the edge of a stack of contract papers. Papers he hadn't seen before, with names and figures that didn't add up. Victoria sat across from him, her posture perfect, her expression unreadable. She looked like she belonged in a courtroom, not their home. The faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner seemed louder than usual, each second a hammer to his chest. "You think I don't know what's going on?" Henry's voice cracked, betraying the anger he'd been trying to hold back. He tossed the crumpled papers onto the desk, their edges fluttering like wounded birds. "You think I'm blind? Or just stupid?" Victoria didn't flinch. Her cold stare cut through him, sharp and unyielding. She leaned back in her chair, crossing her legs with a practiced ease that made his stomach churn. "Henry," she said, her tone as smooth as ice, "you're being paranoid. Again." He wanted to scream. He wanted to grab the desk and flip it over, to watch her perfect composure shatter like glass. But he didn't. Instead, he clenched his fists and took a step closer, his shadow looming over her. "Paranoid? You think this is paranoia? I've seen the texts, Victoria. I've seen the way you look at him. The way you've been distracted." She tilted her head, her lips curling into a faint, mocking smile. "Texts? Really, Henry? You're going to accuse me of something because of a few messages? Maybe you should focus on your own life instead of snooping through mine." Her words were like a knife, twisting deeper with every syllable. He wanted to believe her. God, he wanted to believe her. But the evidence was there, scattered across the desk, in the way she avoided his eyes, in the late nights and sudden business trips. The sponsor's name kept popping up. A man Henry had never met, but whose presence seemed to haunt every corner of their marriage. "You're lying," Henry said, his voice low and trembling. "I know you're lying, and I'm not going to let you gaslight me into thinking I'm crazy. You've been involved with him. Don't try to deny it." Victoria sighed, a sound so heavy with feigned exasperation it made his blood boil. She stood, smoothing her skirt with deliberate slowness, and walked around the desk until she was inches from him. Her perfume, something floral and expensive, filled the air, but it didn't mask the tension between them. "Henry," she said, her voice softer now, almost pitying, "you're imagining things. I've been working. That's it. If you're so insecure, maybe you should talk to someone about it." His hands shook as he reached for the contract papers again, holding them up like a shield. "And these? What about these? You think I don't recognize your handwriting? Your signature? You've been funneling money to him, Victoria. To him. How long has this been going on?" How long have you been betraying me? For a moment, just a moment, he thought he saw something flicker in her eyes. A hint of guilt, maybe, or fear. But it was gone as quickly as it came, replaced by that same icy calm. She reached out, her fingers brushing against his wrist, and he recoiled like she'd burned him. "You're being ridiculous," she said, her voice steady, her gaze unwavering. "I'm not the villain here, Henry. You're the one tearing us apart with these accusations. If you can't trust me, then maybe we don't have anything left." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. He wanted to argue, to fight, to make her admit the truth. But standing there, surrounded by the remnants of their life together, he felt something inside him break. The anger was still there, simmering beneath the surface, but it was overshadowed by a crushing sense of loss. He'd loved her. He'd trusted her. And now, staring into her cold, defiant eyes, he realized she'd never felt the same way. The rain tapped insistently against the windshield, a rhythm that matched the pounding in Henry's head. He sat in the driver's seat of his car, the engine off, the dashboard dimly lit by the glow of the parking lot lights. The air inside was thick, heavy with the scent of wet leather and the faint tang of stale coffee from the cup holder. His hands gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white, but his mind was elsewhere, drifting through the wreckage of the last decade. On the passenger seat lay an old wedding photo, its edges curled and yellowed. He picked it up, his fingers trembling slightly. Victoria's smile in the picture was radiant, her eyes sparkling with something he had mistaken for love. His own face looked younger, softer, untouched by the bitterness that now etched lines into his skin. He traced the glass over her image, his reflection overlapping hers in the rain-streaked surface. The first warning sign had been subtle, almost imperceptible. He remembered it now, a flicker of unease he had brushed aside. It was 3 years ago, during one of her cyber sports tournaments. Victoria had been glued to her phone, texting furiously, her laughter too sharp, too frequent. When he asked who she was talking to, her response had been dismissive. "Just the sponsor. You wouldn't understand." He had let it go, chalking it up to her high-pressure career. But now the memory burned like a brand. Another flashback surfaced, this one more vivid. Last summer, they had been at a team dinner, one of those lavish events where the sponsors rubbed elbows with the players. Victoria had been dazzling in a black dress that hugged her figure, her laughter carrying across the room. Henry had watched from the sidelines, nursing a drink, as she leaned close to a man in a tailored suit, their heads tilted together in what looked like conspiratorial intimacy. When he approached, she introduced the man as just a business associate, her tone light, her eyes avoiding his. He had swallowed his unease, told himself he was being paranoid. But the cracks had widened over time. Her late nights at the office became more frequent, her excuses flimsier. She started wearing perfume he didn't recognize, a scent that clung to her skin long after she came home. And then there were the trips, weekend tournaments, she called them, where she would leave on Friday and return on Sunday, her bags packed with clothes he hadn't seen before. Each time, she would greet him with a kiss that felt more like a formality, her touch distant, her mind elsewhere. The rain outside grew heavier, the droplets blurring the world beyond the windshield into a watery haze. Henry's chest tightened as another memory clawed its way to the surface. Just 6 months ago, he had found a receipt in her purse. A dinner for 2 at an upscale restaurant, one he knew they hadn't been to together. When he confronted her, she laughed it off, saying it was a business meeting. "You're being ridiculous, Henry," she had said, her voice dripping with condescension. He had wanted to believe her, wanted so badly to trust her, but the seed of doubt had already taken root. Now, sitting in the car with the rain pounding down, Henry felt the weight of all those moments pressing down on him. How had he been so blind? How had he missed the signs that now seemed so glaringly obvious? The wedding photo slipped from his fingers, landing face down on the seat. He stared at it, his breath coming in shallow bursts, his hands clenching and unclenching. The rain streaked down the windshield, distorting the world outside into a kaleidoscope of blurred lights and shadows. It mirrored the chaos in his mind, the fragments of memories colliding and shifting, each one a piece of the puzzle he had refused to see. He thought of the way Victoria's laughter had changed, how it had grown colder, sharper, how it had stopped reaching her eyes. He thought of the way she had started dressing, the way she had started talking, the way she had started living, as if he were no longer part of her world. And then, with a sickening clarity, he realized the truth. She had been slipping away from him for years, inch by inch, while he stood by, oblivious, trusting, stupid. The anger surged through him, hot and raw, but it was tempered by a deeper, more crushing sense of loss. He had given her everything. His love, his trust, his loyalty, and she had thrown it all away without a second thought. The rain slowed to a drizzle, the world outside coming back into focus. Henry wiped his face with the back of his hand, his fingers coming away wet. He didn't know if it was rain or tears, and he didn't care. All he knew was that he couldn't stay here, couldn't let her win. He started the car, the engine roaring to life, and pulled out of the parking lot, leaving the wedding photo behind on the seat, face down in the shadows. The rain tapped against the windows of Henry's home office, a steady rhythm that matched the pounding in his temples. The room smelled faintly of stale coffee and the musty scent of old paperwork, a reminder of the countless hours he'd spent here over the years. But tonight, the atmosphere was different. The desk lamp cast a harsh, focused light over the scattered files, each one a piece of the puzzle he was determined to solve. The HR files, once a source of mundane work, now felt like weapons in his hands. Henry leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking under his weight. His eyes flicked to the burner phone he'd bought earlier that day, its screen dark and lifeless. It was a stark contrast to the sleek, encrypted emails he'd been poring over for hours. Victoria had always been meticulous, but even she couldn't erase every digital footprint. He'd found traces of her communication with the sponsor, coded language, vague references to meetings and collaborations. But Henry knew better. He'd seen the way she'd looked at the man during the banquet, the way she'd dismissed Henry with a wave of her hand. It wasn't just business. It never was. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, hesitating. For years, he'd been the quiet one, the supportive husband who stood in the background while Victoria basked in the spotlight. He'd let her take the lead, believing it was what she needed to thrive. But now, the thought of her with that man, her sponsor, her partner in more ways than one, made his stomach churn. The betrayal wasn't just emotional. It was professional, financial, a calculated move that left Henry feeling like a fool. He opened a new document, the cursor blinking impatiently. His HR training kicked in, the years of dealing with misconduct and ethical violations guiding his every move. He began compiling a timeline, cross-referencing dates from their bank statements with Victoria's travel logs. The transfers were the most damning. Large sums of money funneled from their joint account to the sponsor's team, all under the guise of investment opportunities. Henry's jaw tightened as he typed, the words flowing faster with each revelation. He wasn't just collecting evidence. He was building a case, one that would leave Victoria with nowhere to hide. The sound of a car door slamming outside jolted him from his thoughts. He glanced at the clock. 11:47 p.m. Victoria was home. His heart raced as he quickly minimized the screen, shoving the burner phone into a drawer. He could hear her heels clicking against the hardwood floor, the familiar rhythm that once brought him comfort now filling him with dread. The door to the study creaked open, and there she stood, her silhouette framed by the dim hallway light. "Working late?" she asked, her tone casual, almost bored. Henry forced a smile, his fingers trembling slightly as he closed the laptop. "Just catching up on some things," he replied, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. Victoria tilted her head, her eyes narrowing as if sensing something was off. But she didn't press. She never did. "Don't stay up too late," she said, turning to leave. Henry watched her go, the faint scent of her perfume lingering in the air. It was the same scent she'd worn for years, but now it felt foreign, tainted. He waited until he heard the bedroom door close before reopening the laptop, his resolve hardening with each passing second. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about reclaiming his life, his dignity. Victoria had played her games, but Henry was done being a pawn. As the rain continued to fall outside, he typed with renewed purpose, each keystroke a step closer to the truth. And when the time came, he would make sure Victoria felt the full weight of her choices. It started with a notification, a ding from Henry's phone, innocuous and unremarkable, like all the others that had come before it. But this one was different. Overdraft alert. $5,000 withdrawal from joint checking account. Henry froze, the phone cold in his hand. He stared at the screen, the numbers blurring as his mind raced. $5,000? They hadn't touched that account in months. Not since Victoria had insisted on keeping their finances separate, citing her business ventures. The first thing Henry noticed was the date. The withdrawal had been made 2 days ago, while he was at a conference in Chicago. Victoria had been home, supposedly working late. His stomach churned as he opened the banking app, his fingers trembling slightly. He scrolled through the transactions, each one a punch to the gut. $1,000 here, $2,500 there. All funneled into an account he didn't recognize. And there, at the bottom of each transfer, was her signature. Her goddamn signature. He grabbed his laptop, his movements quick and precise, like a man possessed. The bank statements downloaded in a flurry of PDFs, each one a new piece of the puzzle. He cross-referenced the dates with Victoria's calendar, her Instagram posts, her team's tournament schedule. The pattern was undeniable. Every time her cyber sports team had a major event, money disappeared from their account. $10,000 for a sponsorship fee the week before the regional finals. $7,500 for equipment upgrades just days before the championship. And then there were the smaller transfers, $500 here, $1,000 there, always coinciding with nights she claimed to be working late. Henry's breath came in shallow gasps as he pieced it together. She wasn't just funding her lover's team. She was bankrolling his entire operation. The sponsor, that smug bastard who'd been at their house for dinner just last month, was bleeding them dry. And Victoria? She was letting him. No, worse, she was helping him. The overdraft notices piled up on the desk, a stark reminder of how far she'd gone. Their savings account, once robust and secure, was now a hollow shell. The lines of numbers blurred together, but one figure stood out. $78,000. Gone. Vanished into the ether. All to prop up her little fantasy world. Henry's hands clenched into fists, his nails digging into his palms. He thought of all the sacrifices he'd made. The late nights at work, the promotions he'd turned down to support her dreams, the countless hours spent listening to her rants about sponsors and rankings. And for what? So she could throw it all away on some greasy-haired gamer who couldn't even look him in the eye? He grabbed the stack of bank statements, the paper crinkling under his grip. Victoria's signature stared back at him, bold and unapologetic. He traced the loops of her handwriting, the same loops she'd used to sign their marriage license all those years ago. How could someone who once promised to love and cherish him do this? How could she look him in the eye every night and pretend everything was fine? A faint smell of coffee wafted through the room, a bitter reminder of the mornings they'd shared at this very desk. He used to bring her a cup, steaming and sweet, just the way she liked it. Now the mug sat abandoned, a thin layer of dust coating its rim. Henry leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. He wasn't just angry, he was exhausted. The weight of betrayal pressed down on him, heavier than any workload he'd ever shouldered. But beneath the exhaustion, there was something else. A flicker of determination. He wasn't going to let her get away with this. Not this time. He opened a new spreadsheet, his fingers flying across the keyboard. Column after column, row after row, he documented every transfer, every withdrawal, every lie. The numbers told a story, one she couldn't spin her way out of. And when he was done, he printed it all out, the pages warm from the printer. As he stacked the papers neatly on the desk, he noticed something else. A single business card tucked beneath a pile of receipts. It was the sponsor's, glossy and pretentious, with a logo that looked like it had been designed by a teenager. Henry picked it up, his jaw tightening. The name stared back at him, taunting him. He crumpled the card in his fist, the edges digging into his palm. This wasn't just about the money anymore. This was about respect, about dignity. And Henry was done playing the fool. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, each second a reminder of the time he'd wasted. But as he stared at the stack of evidence in front of him, he felt something he hadn't felt in months. Control. Victoria had taken everything from him, his trust, his pride, his future. But she hadn't taken his mind. And that, he realized, was all he needed. He reached for his phone, his fingers steady now. It was time to make some calls. The glow of Henry's laptop screen cast a pale light across the room, illuminating the hard lines of his face as he stared at the email draft. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, trembling slightly, not from hesitation but from the weight of what he was about to unleash. The cursor blinked mockingly, as if daring him to press send. Outside, the rain tapped against the window in a steady rhythm, the kind of rain that felt like it would never stop. Fitting, he thought, for a night like this. He reread the email for what felt like the 100th time. It was concise, clinical, and devastating. No emotional outbursts, no petty insults, just cold, hard facts. Attached were the bank statements showing unauthorized transfers, screenshots of Victoria's encrypted messages with the sponsor, and a timeline of their indiscretions. He'd even included a copy of the contract she'd signed with the sponsor's team, the one that clearly violated the ethics clause of her own organization. It was a masterpiece of calculated destruction, and it had taken him weeks to compile. Henry's throat tightened as he scrolled back to the top of the email. The subject line stared back at him. Urgent, ethical and financial misconduct involving Victoria Carter and sponsor's name. He debated whether to include her name, whether to make it personal, but in the end, he decided it didn't matter. This wasn't about her anymore. It was about reclaiming something he'd lost, his dignity, his sense of control, maybe even his soul. His hand moved to the mouse, the cursor hovering over the send button. For a moment, he hesitated. Not because he doubted his decision, but because he knew there was no going back after this. Once this email went out, it would ripple through Victoria's world like a shockwave, tearing apart everything she'd built. Her career, her reputation, her carefully curated image. It would all crumble. And while part of him relished the thought, another part felt hollow. Was this who he'd become? A man who derived satisfaction from destroying the woman he'd once loved? The image of her face flashed in his mind. Her cold, defiant stare during their last confrontation in the study. She hadn't even flinched when he'd confronted her about the affair. Instead, she'd laughed. A sharp, mocking sound that still echoed in his ears. "You're paranoid, Henry," she'd said, her voice dripping with disdain. "Do you really think I'd risk everything for some fling? You're pathetic." Pathetic. The word burned in his chest like a brand. Maybe she was right. Maybe he had been pathetic. Blind to her lies, deaf to her manipulations, too weak to see what was right in front of him. But not anymore. Tonight he would prove her wrong. With a deep breath, he clicked send. The screen flickered as the email disappeared into the void, a digital missile hurtling toward its targets. For a moment, there was silence, broken only by the soft hum of the laptop and the relentless tapping of the rain. Then, almost immediately, the first red receipt popped up. Opened. 9:47 p.m. Henry stared at the notification, his heart pounding in his chest. One by one, more receipts followed, each one a tiny confirmation that the wheels were now in motion. He leaned back in his chair, his hands resting on the edge of the desk. The room felt colder somehow, the air heavy with the weight of what he'd just done. He didn't feel triumphant, not yet. Instead, there was a strange emptiness, a void where his anger and grief had once been. He'd spent so long planning this moment, imagining how it would feel, but now that it was here, it felt anticlimactic. His phone buzzed on the desk, startling him. He glanced at the screen, half expecting it to be Victoria, already lashing out. But it was just a notification, a reminder about a table tennis match he'd signed up for weeks ago. He stared at it for a moment, then let out a bitter laugh. Life went on, didn't it? Even as his own world was falling apart, the rest of the universe kept spinning, indifferent to his pain. Henry stood up, his legs shaky beneath him, and walked to the window. The rain had picked up, the drops streaking down the glass like tears. He pressed his forehead against the cool pane, closing his eyes. Somewhere out there, Victoria was probably sitting in her office, oblivious to the storm that was about to hit her. And when it did, when the investors started calling, when the sponsors pulled their funding, when her team turned on her, he wondered if she'd finally feel the same pain he'd been carrying for months. But even as the thought crossed his mind, he knew it wouldn't bring him the peace he craved. Revenge wasn't a cure. It was just another kind of poison. And now that he'd taken the first sip, there was no turning back. All he could do was wait, and hope that somewhere, on the other side of this mess, he'd find a way to rebuild what she'd destroyed. Victoria pushed open the front door, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor with the usual arrogance of someone who believed they owned the world. But tonight, the house felt different. The air was heavier, colder, and the faint scent of cardboard and packing tape lingered in the hallway. She paused, her hand still gripping the doorknob, as her eyes fell on the stack of suitcases lined up neatly by the staircase. Her breath hitched. For a moment, she stood frozen, her mind scrambling to make sense of the scene. The suitcases weren't hers. They were Henry's. The realization hit her like a slap, and she felt her chest tighten. She dropped her purse on the floor, the sound echoing through the eerily silent house, and rushed into the living room. There he was, sitting on the couch with a stack of papers in his hands. The divorce papers. His face was unreadable, his eyes fixed on the document, as if he were studying a blueprint for something he'd been planning for years. The room felt barren, stripped of the warmth it once held. The shelves were empty, the photos of their life together gone. Even the clock on the wall had stopped ticking, its hands frozen at some arbitrary hour. "What the hell is this?" Victoria's voice cracked, her usual composure slipping. Henry didn't look up. He simply placed the papers on the coffee table, his movements deliberate, almost mechanical. "It's over," he said, his voice steady but hollow. "I'm done." She stepped closer, her heels clicking louder now, as if she were trying to reclaim the space that no longer felt like hers. "Done? What are you talking about? You can't just—" "I can," he interrupted, finally meeting her gaze. His eyes were tired, but there was a fire in them that she hadn't seen in years. "And I am." Victoria's lips parted, but no words came out. She looked around the room again, her eyes darting to the empty spaces where their life used to be. The bookshelves were bare, the mantel stripped of its decorations. Even the closet in the hallway stood ajar, revealing empty hangers and the faint outline of dust where Henry's clothes used to hang. "You're leaving?" she asked, her voice smaller now, almost childlike. "I already have," he replied, standing up. He towered over her, but there was no anger in his posture, no aggression, just a quiet, unshakable resolve. "I've filed for divorce. The papers are there. You can sign them or you can fight me. Either way, it's over." Victoria's hands trembled as she reached for the papers. Her eyes scanned the first page, the words blurring together as her vision clouded with tears. She hadn't cried in years, not since she was a teenager, but now she felt the heat of it building behind her eyes. "You can't do this," she whispered, though the words felt weak, even to her. Henry didn't respond. He just stood there, his hands in his pockets, his expression unreadable. The silence between them was deafening, broken only by the faint rustle of the papers as Victoria flipped through them. "You're really leaving me?" she asked, her voice breaking. Henry exhaled slowly, his shoulders sagging under the weight of everything they'd been through. "You left me a long time ago, Victoria. I'm just finally catching up." She opened her mouth to argue, to defend herself, but the words caught in her throat. Instead, she looked around the room again, taking in the emptiness, the finality of it all. The house felt like a shell, a hollow reminder of the life they'd built and destroyed. Henry picked up his suitcase, the wheels scraping against the floor as he turned toward the door. He paused for a moment, his hand resting on the doorknob, and glanced back at her. "I hope it was worth it," he said quietly, and then he was gone. Victoria stood in the middle of the living room, the divorce papers clutched in her hands, the weight of his words pressing down on her chest. She looked around at the empty walls, the barren shelves, the silence that now filled the space. For the first time in years, she felt truly alone. The house, once a symbol of their success, now felt like a tomb. The air was thick with the smell of cardboard and dust, and the faint sound of Henry's car engine fading into the distance was the only reminder that he had ever been there at all. She sank onto the couch, the papers slipping from her hands and scattering across the floor. The silence was unbearable, and for the first time in her life, Victoria realized she had no one to blame but herself. The clock on the wall remained frozen, its hands stuck in time, just like their marriage. And as she sat there, surrounded by the emptiness, she wondered if she'd ever feel whole again. The courtroom felt like a vacuum, sucking the air out of Henry's lungs as he sat rigid in his chair. The wooden bench beneath him was hard and unyielding, much like the woman sitting across the room. Victoria's face was a mask of icy composure, but Henry could see the cracks forming. Her fingers twitching, the faint tremor in her jaw. She hadn't expected him to fight back. Not like this. The evidence folder in front of him felt heavier than it should, stuffed with bank statements, emails, and photos that told a story she tried so hard to bury. When his lawyer stood to present the case, Henry's mind drifted back to the first time he'd seen her in that cyber sports arena, her eyes gleaming with ambition. Back then, he'd mistaken it for passion, for drive. Now he saw it for what it was, hunger. A hunger that had consumed everything. Their marriage, their finances, even their son's trust. The gavel's sharp crack pulled him back to the present, and he watched as Victoria's lawyer floundered, trying to spin her betrayal into some kind of misunderstanding. But the evidence was undeniable. The unauthorized transfers, the late-night rendezvous with her sponsor, the way she'd siphoned money from their joint account to fund her lover's team. It was all there, laid bare for the judge to see. Victoria's composure shattered when the judge ruled in Henry's favor. Her face crumpled, tears streaking her perfectly applied makeup. For a moment, Henry almost felt sorry for her. Almost. But then he remembered the nights he'd spent alone, staring at the ceiling, wondering why she was always working late. He remembered the way she'd mocked him at that damn banquet, her laughter echoing in his ears long after the guests had gone home. No, this wasn't about vengeance anymore. It was about survival, about reclaiming the pieces of himself she'd chipped away over the years. As the courtroom emptied, Henry lingered for a moment, staring at the evidence folder on the table. Felt strange, holding so much power in his hands. He'd spent years feeling powerless. But now, it was Victoria who had nothing left. No money, no reputation, no alibis. Just the cold, hard truth of what she'd done. He picked up the folder and walked out without looking back, the weight of it finally lifting as he stepped into the crisp afternoon air. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the courthouse steps, and for the first time in years, Henry felt like he could breathe again. The first rays of sunlight crept through the blinds of Henry's new apartment, painting streaks of gold across the scuffed wooden floor. He sat at the small kitchen table, staring at the new key resting in his palm. It felt strange, almost foreign, like a relic from a life he hadn't quite earned yet. The apartment was quiet, too quiet, but it was his. No shared spaces, no lingering traces of Victoria's perfume, no reminders of the hollow promises that had filled their home for years. He leaned back in his chair, the table tennis paddle he'd found in a thrift store propped against the wall. It was a stupid purchase, really. He hadn't played in years. Not since the early days of his marriage when he and Victoria used to laugh over clumsy volleys in their tiny backyard. But something about the paddle had called to him, a relic of a simpler time, maybe, or a symbol of the life he was trying to rebuild. He wasn't sure yet. The courtroom still lingered in his mind like a bad taste. The gavel slamming down, Victoria's face crumpling as the judge read the terms of the divorce settlement. She tried to play the victim, of course, but the evidence had been too damning. The emails, the bank statements, the whispered confessions from her own son. It had all been laid bare. Henry had expected to feel triumph, but all he'd felt was exhaustion. A hollow victory, like winning a war that had already burned everything to the ground. He stood and walked to the window, the sunrise casting long shadows across the room. The city was waking up, cars humming in the distance, people shuffling to work with their heads down. For the first time in years, Henry felt like he was part of that world again. Not just a ghost haunting the edges of someone else's life. He'd spent so long trying to hold everything together, trying to be the man Victoria wanted him to be. But now he was just Henry. No titles, no expectations, no masks. The smell of freshly brewed coffee filled the apartment. Another small indulgence he'd allowed himself. He poured a cup and took a sip, savoring the bitterness. It wasn't perfect, but it was his. Just like the apartment, just like his life now. He didn't know what came next. Maybe he'd find a new hobby. Maybe he'd start dating again. Or maybe he'd just sit here for a while, watching the sunrise and figuring out who he was without the weight of Victoria's betrayal pressing down on him. He glanced at the table tennis paddle again, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Maybe he'd find someone to play with someday. Someone who didn't see him as a stepping stone or a punchline. Someone who'd laugh with him, not at him. For now, though, he was content to sit in the quiet, the sunlight warming his face, and let the world spin on without him for a little while longer. Henry had lost a lot, but he'd found something too, something he hadn't realized he'd lost along the way. Himself. And that, he decided, was worth every scar, every sleepless night, every tear. He turned away from the window, the new key still clutched in his hand, and walked back to the table. The sun was higher now, the shadows receding. A new day, a new life, and for the first time in a long time, Henry felt like he was ready to face it.